Why did they look right through her? The desert dawn broke with a ruthless, indifferent energy. It spilled a weak, dusty light over the convoy as it cut through the endless Iraqi scrub. 3 Humvees, armored slabs of steel, built to endure everything except the casual, constant contempt Rosa felt radiating from within them. And then there was her, the armored ambulance. Its oversized red crosses were a silent, hopeful lie in a landscape that had long forgotten the rules of engagement. Behind the wheel, in the reinforced cocoon of the aid vehicle, sat Staff Sergeant Rosa Dean. Her hands were steady on the massive steering wheel. They were a sharp, stark contrast to the fine brown haze of sand that coated the windshield, kicked up violently by the churning tires of the lead truck. She was present. She was driving. She was essential in the most fundamental, logistical way. But in the 3 weeks she'd been running supply and medical routes out of Forward Operating Base Phoenix, Rosa Dean had become entirely invisible to the people who considered themselves the real soldiers. A logistics cog, an ambulance driver, a warm body filling a required slot that needed the minimum security clearance possible. The radio crackled with the kind of routine, meaningless chatter that fills the empty space between one disaster and the next. It was the sound of boredom masquerading as vigilance. She guided the heavy vehicle through the final checkpoint with an ease that came from practiced, meticulous movement. It was a graceful efficiency few people ever truly acquire. The gate guards barely glanced at her identification. Just another run done. Just another day spent driving while the men did the real work. She felt it, this invisibility. It wasn't just professional slight, it was a heavy, emotional blanket. It was woven from the persistent indifference of her peers, ignored. But this feeling wasn't new. It was a familiar, unwelcome shadow from a life she was trying to leave behind. A kind of necessary emotional armor she'd worn for years. The kind that allows you to operate at the peak of your ability while everyone around you writes you off completely. She parked in the motor pool. The methodical precision of her post-mission checks began. It was a precision that bordered on the obsessive. But who would notice? Nobody was paying attention to the ambulance driver. She was checking tire pressure, visualizing the brake lines, confirming the fluid levels with a depth of focus that suggested she was preparing for a transcontinental haul rather than a short trip back into the motor pool. It was her defense mechanism. The relentless, perfect execution of the small, meaningless tasks. It kept the past at bay. It kept the suppressed competence from bubbling up. Nearby, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb and his fire team were loading their gear. Their conversation was loud enough to carry, a booming soundtrack of casual, self-assured disrespect that grated against the silence of the desert. Webb carried the kind of aggressive confidence earned from 3 combat deployments, a chest heavy with medals and commendations. Commendations he made sure everyone knew about. His team, Specialist Thompson, Corporal Davis, and Private First Class Martinez, orbited him. Young, eager, hungry to prove themselves by mirroring Webb's bravado. "Heard they're assigning us a driver for the next op," Thompson said, checking his rifle sling. Then came the familiar, casual knife twist. "Please tell me it's not the ambulance girl again." Webb laughed. The sound was clear. It carried across the motor pool and struck Rosa like a physical blow. She did not flinch. "Dean, she's fine for supply runs, I guess," Webb scoffed, adjusting his body armor. "Point A to point B without getting lost, good for her." His voice dropped slightly, the tone venomous with certainty. But actual combat operations, she'd probably freeze up the first time she heard incoming fire. The words were designed to wound. They were designed to remind her of her place. They were the collective narrative of the base, that she was soft, that she was protected, that she was only capable of safe things. Thompson added his 2 cents. "I don't know why they even sent her here. We've got plenty of personnel who can drive and fight. What's the point of someone who can only do one?" Private First Class Martinez, the youngest one, the quietest one, didn't join the mockery. But he didn't contradict it either. He just looked down at his boots. The implicit agreement was clear to everyone, especially Rosa. She was dead weight, a liability, just a warm body. Rosa continued her checks. The methodical process became a shield, a spiritual barrier against the casual institutional cruelty. She had heard variations of this conversation for 3 weeks straight. The words theoretically slid off her. Harmless, because she'd learned years ago that those who talked the loudest about their capabilities were rarely the ones who delivered when the situation turned desperate. The silence she maintained was her only power, a quiet dignity. But still, a bitter, anxious feeling churned deep in her gut. She was tired of the pretense, tired of the cover. Yet she had volunteered for this quiet purgatory. It was meant to be a transition, a cool-down phase after a life lived on a razor's edge. The anxiety was the fear that she would be forced to reveal herself, the fear of what that revelation would mean for her future. She finished her inspection. The logging of the mileage was perfect. She secured the vehicle and headed for the barracks. The movement was economical, fluid. Too fluid for an ambulance driver, perhaps, but there was something she hadn't told them. Not yet. Something she had hoped to keep buried for the entire deployment. A history that made her hands steady, that kept her eyes constantly scanning, that meant she never, ever had to ask for directions. She was walking away from the noise, but the quiet of her past was catching up to her. The relentless precision of her life was the only thing preventing her from breaking. She was a prisoner of her own competence, a secret waiting for a disaster to force it out. She just had to hold the line. She just had to remain ignored. The weight of the unshared truth was physically exhausting. It was like wearing a heavy coat in the desert heat. Every day she had to act slightly less aware, slightly less capable than she actually was. It was a performance for the sake of an honorable discharge, for the sake of a quiet life after the war. But a war zone is the worst place to seek peace. And the desert, she knew, had a ruthless way of stripping away all pretense. She was waiting for the inevitable moment when the mask would slip or be torn off. The moment she would stop being Rosa Dean, the ambulance driver, and start being the shadow operative she had spent 7 years becoming. And that moment, she sensed, was much closer than the command believed. The sun climbed higher, baking the motor pool. Webb's laughter faded, but the echo of his contempt lingered, a low, persistent hum. It fueled her anxiety. The anxiety wasn't about being found out. It was about the possibility of people dying because they refused to believe she could do more. The anxiety that their arrogance would cost them everything, and that she would have to stand by or risk her entire future to save them. She walked through the dust, the epitome of a professional soldier, but with a secret life tucked away behind her quiet eyes. The sheer willpower it took to remain invisible was her daily battle, a battle waged in silence, unnoticed, and ultimately alone. The true war, she knew, was always fought on the inside. But there was something she hadn't told them, not yet. The silence that followed the departure of the convoy was the deep, heavy quiet of a base trying to pretend it was safe. The silence was the real danger. It allowed the subtle, corrosive effects of complacency to set in. Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Reeves was the only one who seemed to understand the texture of that silence. Reeves had been watching from the maintenance bay, a man who saw the world not through rhetoric, but through systems and anomalies. What he saw didn't match what everyone else was seeing. He saw the way Rosa moved around the ambulance, not the clumsy, forced movements of a soldier fulfilling a minimum requirement. Her movements suggested an awareness that went far beyond basic driver training. It was the little things that accumulated in his mind like the desert sand on the barracks floor. He noticed her during the morning security briefing, always facing the entry points, her back never to an open space. An unconscious habit, a hardwired defensive reflex. He noticed the state of her personal weapon, the standard-issue M4 carbine that every soldier carried. It wasn't just clean enough to pass a white glove inspection. That was standard discipline. It was configured in a very specific way, a setup that maximized rapid acquisition and minimized snag points during complex movement. A configuration Reeves had only seen once before, in a classified briefing about maritime special operations doctrine. A simple ambulance driver didn't carry a rifle configured like that. Mystery. One evening, Reeves found her in the motor pool, long after hours. The desert air was cool, carrying the scent of diesel and dust. She wasn't driving. She wasn't cleaning the exterior. She was reorganizing the medical supplies inside the ambulance's high-roofed cargo area. The standard loadout was good, professional, but she was modifying it. Trauma supplies were positioned for one-handed access in low-light conditions. Tourniquets were packed for rapid deployment from specific, index pouches. The hemostatic agents were arranged in the exact configuration used by special operations medics working in highly denied areas, where every second saved on a procedure meant the difference between life and death. This wasn't just organization. It was a system designed for survival under duress. "That's an interesting setup you've got there, Dean," Reeves commented from the doorway. His voice was quiet, carefully neutral. He wasn't accusing, he was fishing. Rosa's hands paused for only a fraction of a second. The internal beat of an operative caught slightly off guard. A flicker of being exposed passed through her eyes, quickly suppressed. She didn't jump. She didn't turn with surprise. She simply continued her work. "Just optimizing for efficiency, Chief," she replied, her voice low and even. "Making sure everything's accessible if we take casualties during transport." Reeves walked closer, allowing the silence to stretch. He looked at the precise indexing of the burn sheets and the carefully organized intubation kits. "That's not standard ambulance configuration," he said quietly. "That's combat medic loadout for high-threat environments, the kind where you're operating outside the golden hour." She looked up at him, her brown eyes completely unreadable. There was no defiance, only the truth veiled in generalities. "Previous assignment had some unique requirements, Chief," she said. "Old habits die hard." Reeves let it drop. He nodded, acknowledging the coded response. But he filed the observation, adding it to the growing, incongruous profile that refused to match the paperwork. He understood a fundamental truth of war zones. Everyone who deployed to a place like Phoenix carried secrets from previous assignments. Most people were just better at hiding them. Rosa Dean's secret wasn't fully hidden. It was there, an unwavering shadow of determination baked into her every subtle movement. Reeves was beginning to see the wolf beneath the sheep's wool, intrigue, and a growing sense of isolation for Rosa. She was alone in her level of preparation, alone in her awareness. The next day, the intelligence brief arrived. It came with the kind of casual, bureaucratic delivery that suggested nobody in the chain of command truly believed the threat assessment they were distributing. A piece of paper they had to acknowledge, but didn't have to internalize. Yet, the details were chilling to anyone who chose to listen. Enemy activity had increased dramatically over the past 2 weeks. Drone surveillance showed unusual movement patterns. Communications intercepts suggested coordinated planning among multiple militant groups that normally operated independently. Local informants had gone completely silent, a pattern that indicated systematic intimidation or elimination. The analysts included the standard recommendations: enhanced security, increased vigilance. These were the bureaucratic checkbox items that everyone acknowledged in official documents without actually acting upon. Why the complacency? Forward Operating Base Phoenix had enjoyed relative security for the past year. The assumption of continued safety was subtle, largely unspoken, but completely pervasive. A collective, dangerous inertia had settled over the base. Base Commander Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell reviewed the assessment during her weekly staff meeting. Her department heads displayed expressions ranging from genuine concern to obvious boredom. "Elevated threat environment across the operational sector," she summarized, her voice firm. "Possible preparation for coordinated action against coalition installations. Recommend enhanced perimeter security and restricted movement protocols." She looked around the conference room. "Standard precautions apply. Maintain alertness. Follow established security protocols. Don't assume continued safety." Nobody raised a question. They'd received virtually identical threat warnings monthly for over a year. Nothing had ever materialized beyond the occasional harassing fire. Phoenix felt as secure as anywhere in Iraq could reasonably feel. The danger felt distant, an academic threat confined to printed pages and PowerPoint slides. Rosa heard about the brief third hand, reading the sanitized summary posted on the operations board near the mess hall. Her reaction was fundamentally different from her colleagues' casual dismissal. Her instincts, honed in a different life, screamed danger. She felt a rising, urgent sense of anxiety. It wasn't a sudden panic. It was a cold, calculated awareness of impending kinetic threat. She spent extra time on her vehicle inspections that week, checking systems that went far beyond standard maintenance requirements. She verified her personal weapon had a full combat load of ammunition, perfectly indexed. She reviewed escape routes from various base locations. She identified covered positions she could reach from the barracks. Just mental exercises, she told herself, professional habits from a previous career. But survival instincts forged in desperate circumstances don't conveniently fade just because official paperwork gives you a new job title. The knowledge was a burden, a heavy, persistent premonition of violence. She was the only one preparing for the storm, the only one hearing the silent ticking clock. She felt the immense, suffocating weight of her isolation. She was the Cassandra in the motor pool. She knew something was coming. She could feel the air getting thick, the desert holding its breath. She knew the difference between a routine threat warning and a shift in the air. And tonight, the air tasted like blood. But she would remain silent as promised until the very last possible moment. The cost of that silence was her peace of mind. The only reward was the hope that when the time came, she would be ready. The darkness held its breath, and then it shattered. The assault commenced at 2:37 hours. The base was operating at minimum manning levels, a state of maximum vulnerability. Under a moonless, inky, absolute sky, the first rocket-propelled grenade streaked out of the darkness. It didn't whistle or scream. It was a silent, fast-moving shadow. The impact point was calculated, intentional, the fuel storage depot. The detonation was catastrophic, a massive yellow-orange explosion that instantaneously lit up the entire night. It was an artificial, terrifying daylight. The blast wave hit the barracks moments later, a physical punch that rattled bones. The noise was beyond hearing, it was a physical force. It triggered every alarm system simultaneously. It shocked everyone from a deep, peaceful sleep into immediate, brutal crisis mode. There was no gradual transition, no grogginess. Just the sharp, clean moment of dread. Rosa came awake instantly. The kind of hyper-alert consciousness that skips past confusion. The distinctive sound of the explosion triggered a recognition that bypassed conscious thought. Incoming fire, major attack, get to your vehicle. Her body, honed by years of immediate violence, moved on autopilot. She was dressed, secured, and armed in under 30 seconds. A practiced ritual performed in the absolute dark. She was moving through the barracks while others were still stumbling, fumbling for their weapons, trying to process the scale of the destruction. Before anyone could organize a response, 6 more RPGs followed in rapid succession. They walked their destruction methodically across the base. The precision was chilling. The command center took a direct hit, followed by the communications hub. Both erupted in fierce, yellow flames. The main generator facility exploded next, plunging large sections of the base into darkness. The only illumination now came from the fires raging across the compound. Then the mortars started falling in earnest. Not random harassment, but precisely targeted indirect fire from multiple, coordinated positions. The enemy had studied American defensive patterns. They had identified critical infrastructure. They were now systematically destroying base capabilities. A sense of sinking, cold dread hit everyone who understood the sequence. This was not a skirmish. The ground assault was absolutely inevitable. It was a coordinated military operation. Rosa reached the motor pool, moving low and fast. Her movement was instinctive, seeking cover even in the open space. The ambulance sat exactly where she'd left it, armored, waiting. The keys were in her pocket, always on her person, another habit from that previous life. The radio crackled with frantic, disintegrating traffic. The voices were ragged, panicked. All units, we have multiple breaches on the north and east perimeters. QRF mobilizing to Sector 3. Medical standby for mass casualties. Say again, mass casualties expected. Rosa grabbed the handset. Her voice was the only calm sound on the frequency. Phoenix Medical 1, ambulance operational and ready for casualty evacuation. Where do you need me? A harried, unrecognizable voice responded. Medical 1, hold position at the aid station. We've got wounded coming in hot. Stand by for transport. She acknowledged and started the engine. The ambulance's massive diesel engine roared to life. Even as she drove toward the aid station, she could see the tactical situation deteriorating rapidly. Tracer fire arced across the compound like deadly, glowing insects. The ammunition storage bunker detonated in a massive secondary blast. The aid station was already taking intermittent small arms fire. Webb and his fire team ran past her, moving toward the eastern perimeter. Even in the chaos, Webb found time to shout, his voice frantic, laced with terror. Dean, get that ambulance to the aid station and stay there. Let the real soldiers handle the fighting. She didn't respond. She couldn't spare the breath or the concentration. She was reading the battlefield. Her eyes, unblinking, saw a scenario she had seen before in other places in other wars. This was not a probing attack. This was a coordinated military assault by fighters who understood exactly what they were doing. The intensity was coming, and she felt a fierce, burning, renewed determination rising to meet the challenge. She was going to be needed. The pretense was over. The time for quiet logistics was done. The time for the shadow operator to emerge had arrived. But her immediate focus was the job she was currently assigned, saving the wounded. Her personal weapon was still locked in the rack. Her primary task was the massive, reinforced engine beneath her hood. She drove into the maelstrom, the red crosses on her vehicle a beacon of desperate, flickering hope. How many times could a heartbeat pause before breaking? The aid station was not just chaos. It was a meat grinder, barely contained by the sheer, raw discipline of the medical staff. Wounded soldiers were arriving almost faster than the medics could tag them. A sergeant with arterial leg bleeding. A lieutenant with shrapnel embedded near his spine. A specialist whose arm was barely attached. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, dust, and fear. The medical staff worked with practiced efficiency, but Rosa could see the math working against them. The facility wasn't equipped for the volume of casualties this attack would generate. And worse, they were taking fire. Intermittent but close. The threat was physical, immediate, and growing. The senior medic, Staff Sergeant James Carter, spotted her. His face was streaked with blood and sweat, his eyes wide with adrenaline. He pointed to 3 litter patients, stabilized for now but requiring immediate surgery. Dean, these 3 need immediate transport to the surgical facility. Now, can you get them there? Rosa looked at the route. 300 meters of open ground, currently being swept by intermittent machine gun fire from enemy positions that had already penetrated the outer perimeter. The distance was short, but the exposure was total. Doable, but it would require timing, speed, and a reckless disregard for personal safety. I can get them there, she said simply. Her voice was the anchor in the storm. The lack of hesitation, the pure, unadulterated commitment to the task, was a balm to Carter's fraying nerves. They loaded the casualties quickly. Rosa strapped them in, ensuring they were secure against the coming violence. Checking IV lines, making sure nothing would come loose during rapid, evasive movement. She saw the pain in their eyes, the shock, the silent plea for survival. This is why you are here, her inner voice commanded. This is the one thing they cannot do. She slid behind the wheel. Her mind was already calculating the route. Not the direct path, that was now covered by fire and blocked by debris. She'd use the cover of damaged, burning buildings. She'd move only during the brief pauses in the enemy fire pattern. She accelerated hard. The heavy ambulance roared, using its armored mass to smash through the debris blocking her alternate route. Rounds sparked off the reinforced panels, the sound a sharp, continuous thwack thwack thwack. One shattered the passenger window, showering her with tiny, glittering glass shards. But she kept moving, weaving between obstacles, driving not just with speed but with a tactical awareness of angles and deflection. The patients were getting thrown around in the back, the movement violent. Alive and thrown around, beat dead and comfortable, she muttered to herself, her eyes fixed on the entrance. She reached the surgical facility. She backed up to the entrance, using the vehicle as a shield, keeping the rear ramp away from the incoming fire. The surgical team retrieved the wounded. As soon as the ramp was clear, she was moving. 3 more coming in, Carter's voice crackled over the radio, tense and weary. Dean, can you make another run? Rosa was already turning the ambulance around before the question was even fully asked. The blood in the back of the ambulance, the shrapnel in the seat, the burning smell of overheated steel, it all faded into the background. On my way. She made 4 more runs in the next 30 minutes, each one more dangerous than the last, each one a delicate dance with death. The routes changed constantly as new debris and new enemy positions emerged. She was reading the flow of the battle like a river, finding the safest, fastest current. On the 5th run, an RPG missed her vehicle by less than 3 meters. The explosion was closer this time, a tremendous, violent shockwave that rocked the ambulance. It left her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. She had to grip the wheel with white-knuckled focus to keep the heavy vehicle on the road. But she kept driving, kept moving wounded soldiers from the aid station to surgery, because people would die if she didn't do it. This was the job. This was the ultimate silent sacrifice. It was an internal, quiet promise to those who had fought and fallen, to those who were relying on the anonymity of the driver to deliver them to safety. She was a lifeline forged in steel and driven by a secret, fierce determination. Her uniform was covered in the blood of others, but she was, for now, miraculously untouched. She continued to move. She continued to breathe. Her survival was a testament to training that nobody knew she possessed. But the 6th run, that would be different. The enemy was adapting, and the clock was about to run out on her luck and her cover. The machine gun was a scream they couldn't answer. Rosa was pulling up for the 6th run. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the acrid smell of burning electronics. The base was becoming a graveyard of machinery and steel. She was loading 2 more patients, a young private with a traumatic leg injury and an older sergeant with what looked like a bad head wound, when the disaster struck. The aid station took direct fire from a heavy machine gun, a long, sustained burst. The sound wasn't the distant thwack of the previous fire. This was close. It was deep, guttural, and terrifying. It sounded like a buzzsaw tearing through concrete. The position was clearly on the eastern ridge overlooking their location. The burst walked across the sandbag barrier. It shredded the medical tent awning, forcing everyone, medics, walking wounded, and Rosa, to take cover instantaneously. Rosa dropped flat, instinctively rolling behind the rear tire of her ambulance. But from her low position, peering out into the swirling dust, she saw the problem immediately. The machine gun had a clear, unobstructed line of sight. It covered both the aid station entrance and the entire 300-meter route to the surgical facility. Any vehicle trying to move now would be exposed for at least 10 seconds. 10 seconds of sustained, heavy-caliber fire, more than enough time for that gunner to tear through even the ambulance's armored panels. The run was impossible. The lifeline was severed. "We're pinned," Carter stated, his voice a ragged whisper filled with despair. He was crouched beside her, cradling his helmet. "Can't move. Can't evacuate the casualties. That gun needs to be taken out." He was looking at his medic bag, then back at the wounded, calculating their remaining time. It wasn't long, minutes. Webb's strained, urgent voice came over the radio, confirming the disaster from his position near the perimeter. All units, we've got enemy fighters inside the wire on the eastern perimeter. Hostiles have breached the inner security barrier. QRF is engaged but taking heavy casualties. We need immediate support. Webb was fighting for his life, unable to pivot to help them. Rosa's mind was already running through options, tactical calculations that came from a place deeper than her current assignment. The machine gun position was maybe 200 meters away, elevated, protected by natural rock outcroppings. A direct assault from the base would be suicide for any infantry team. But she remembered the drainage culvert, the concrete-lined tunnel large enough for a person. It ran along the eastern side of the compound, completely unseen by the high ground. It would put someone within effective, lethal range. It was an impossible, last-ditch option. She looked at her ambulance, at the wounded soldiers lying helpless on the litters, and then she looked at the M4 rifle, the weapon mounted in the cab, the weapon she'd been carrying for 3 weeks, never firing it, the weapon everyone assumed was decorative, the weapon that was her truth. Carter, following her gaze, saw her looking at the rifle and misunderstood. "Dean, don't even think about it," he warned, his eyes wide. "You're a driver, not infantry. We'll call for fire support. The Apache are due back soon." Rosa spoke quietly, her voice low and steady. The calm in her voice was terrifying because it signaled absolute, irreversible resolve. "Fire support is already engaged across 3 other sectors, Carter. They're not coming here." She pointed at the casualties. "And those casualties will die if we can't evacuate them in the next 10 minutes. We both know it." She moved. She moved to the ambulance and retrieved her rifle. The weapon came up naturally. Muscle memory guiding hands that knew exactly what they were doing. Her movements were a dance of efficiency. She checked the chamber, verified the magazine. Every motion was economical, practiced, beautiful in its deadly function. "Dean, what are you doing?" Carter's voice carried pure alarm and confusion. She met his eyes, and for the first time in 3 weeks she dropped the facade. The invisible woman was gone. In her place was an operator. "I'm going to eliminate that machine gun position so you can evacuate these casualties." The statement was not a question or a boast. It was a simple, operational briefing. "Give me 8 minutes." Carter shook his head, denial battling the grim reality. "That's insane. You'll be killed before you get 50 meters." "Probably not," Rosa said. The cold honesty was striking. "But if I am, someone else can try. Those soldiers don't have 8 minutes to wait." Before anyone could stop her, she was moving. She moved low and fast across the debris-strewn ground, the rifle held high, ready. She moved not like a driver trying to play soldier, but like a predator moving in for the kill. She moved toward the culvert entrance. She ran, not from fear, but toward the very source of it. The rising resolve was complete. The time for the secret identity was over. She didn't move like a driver. She moved like a phantom. The culvert was exactly where her detailed, subconscious mental mapping had placed it. A concrete maw leading beneath the earth. It was hidden from the enemy position by a collapsed fuel trailer. A perfect, accidental blind spot. She entered low and fast, the rifle leading the way, every sense alert to the change in acoustic signatures. 60 meters of controlled movement through a confined, dark space. Her knees scraped against the rough concrete. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. She could hear the machine gun firing in sustained bursts above her. The vibrations of the heavy weapon traveled through the earth and into the concrete. She could feel the violence, but she couldn't see it. She had done this kind of approach countless times, in other wars, in other countries, where the stakes were just as high, but the anonymity had been guaranteed. This was different. This time, if she failed her cover, her whole future would be exposed for nothing. She slowed her pace. Each footfall was calculated. She moved not on her feet but on the outside edges of her boots, gliding. The darkness of the tunnel was absolute. She relied on her other senses, the feel of the dust in the air, the distant scent of gunpowder mixing with the sewage smell of the drain, the subtle slope of the concrete beneath her. She emerged from the culvert behind the enemy position. It was a clean exit, unseen. The machine gun team, 3 fighters, were completely focused on the base below. They were professional, they were competent, they were dangerous, and they were completely unaware that death had just crept up behind them. Rosa took 3 seconds to assess the situation. 3 seconds of crystallized time. 3 seconds to calculate the firing angles. 3 seconds to determine the sequence that would neutralize all 3 targets before they could respond. She registered the wind, the noise level, the proximity of the spare ammunition. Then she moved. The movement was one fluid explosion of motion. She didn't aim. She pointed. The weapon came up to her shoulder with the instinctive ease of a part of her own body. The suppressed crack of her rifle was barely audible over the machine gun's continuous fire. The first fighter dropped, the back of his helmet hitting the rock with a dull thud. He never knew she was there. He was simply removed from the battlefield. The second fighter registered the sound. He started to turn, his hand instinctively reaching for his own rifle, but Rosa's second controlled pair of shots arrived. They caught him high in the chest. He stumbled, his own momentum collapsing him forward. The third fighter finally registered the totality of the moment. His eyes widened in shock. He started to pivot the machine gun toward the new threat, but he didn't have enough time. The rounds dropped him next to his companions. 8 seconds from the first shot to absolute silence. The rhythmic, terrible, terrifying scream of the machine gun stopped. The sudden, total absence of noise was deafening. It was a void of sound that seemed to suck all the air out of the desert. Rosa immediately secured the position. She moved to the captured machine gun. The blood, the mess, the reality of what she had just done, it was all compartmentalized. She focused on the immediate task, turning the captured weapon to face back along the enemy approach route. The position was clear. She keyed her radio. Her voice was steady, professional. "Aid station, this is Dean. Machine gun position neutralized. You're clear to evacuate." There was a long silence on the radio, a moment of disbelief that stretched into an eternity. Then Carter's voice. It was hoarse, carrying a mixture of awe and confusion. "Dean, what? How did you?" "Evacuate your casualties, Staff Sergeant. We can discuss my training background later if we're still alive." She didn't wait for a response. She mounted the captured machine gun. It was a PKM, Russian-designed, a weapon she theoretically should never have trained on, but she knew exactly how to employ it. She had eliminated the threat. Now she would become the shield. Her controlled fury was channeled into absolute lethal precision. When the dust settled, she found the silence louder than the war. Rosa stayed in the captured position for the next 40 minutes. She was exposed. She knew it. But from her elevated vantage point, she had a perfect, tactical view of the eastern flank. She used the captured machine gun to provide covering fire. She wasn't just defending, she was shaping the battlefield. Enemy fighters attempted to advance across the open ground. They were met with accurate, devastating fire from the position that was supposed to be supporting their assault. Rosa demonstrated a deep understanding of crew-served weapons. She used short, controlled bursts, a kind of patient, methodical violence that was far more effective than spraying fire. 3 separate, desperate attempts to retake the high ground failed. She was a force of quiet, specialized violence. She had turned their strength into their weakness. She was fighting a different war than the one being waged below. A war of tactical advantage and overwhelming competence. The tactical situation began to stabilize as the first Apache helicopters arrived. The unmistakable, thunderous sound of the heavy attack helicopters. Their appearance was the breaking point for the ground assault. The enemy realized they had lost their supporting fires. The retreat began. The intensity bled out of the night, replaced by the crackle of distant small arms fire and the roar of the Apache. Within 20 minutes, the base perimeter was secure. The all-clear alarm sounded, a redundant, almost mocking sound after the violence of the night. Rosa collected the captured weapons, methodically securing the PKM and slinging her own rifle. She began her walk back down. The exhaustion finally hit, a heavy, beautiful, leaden weight of survival. It was a relief that tasted like ash and cordite. Her uniform was torn and covered in dust, sweat, and the blood of others, but she was whole. Carter met her at the entrance to the aid station. His expression showed he was looking at someone completely different from the ambulance driver he'd worked alongside for 3 weeks. Behind him, Webb and his fire team were staring at her. Their expressions ranged from shock to utter awe. They were seeing the physical manifestation of all the things they had denied. "Those casualties made it to surgery," Carter said, his voice thick with emotion. "All of them stable, all of them alive, because you took out that gun position." Rosa nodded, too tired for an extensive conversation. "Good, that's what mattered." "Dean, what you just did," Webb started, struggling to reconcile the myth with the reality. "That wasn't normal. Soldiers can't. Normal soldiers can't take out a fortified position alone," she finished for him. She looked at his face, seeing the brokenness of his professional arrogance. "I know. Can we discuss this after I've filed my after-action report and gotten some rack time?" She didn't offer an explanation. She didn't seek praise. She just sought the quiet of her bunk. Before anyone could respond, a Humvee pulled up. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell emerged. Her face was grim, but her eyes held a fierce respect. She was accompanied by a man in civilian clothes, Robert Harrison, from the Defense Intelligence Agency. The civilian had the weathered face of someone who had spent years doing difficult things in hard places. When his eyes found Rosa, recognition and respect passed between them. It was a silent acknowledgement of a shared world, a world of shadows and lethal competence. Mitchell, ever the commander, spoke carefully. "Staff Sergeant Dean, Mr. Harrison has requested to speak with you immediately regarding tonight's events." Rosa looked at Harrison and knew exactly why he was there. The carefully maintained cover she'd built over 3 weeks had just evaporated in 40 minutes of doing what she'd been trained to do. The secret was out. The exposure was total. "Yes, ma'am, happy to provide whatever information is needed." She felt a different kind of exhaustion now, the weariness of having her past become her present. Her unveiling was complete. She braced herself for the questions. The answers, she knew, would change everything. The world she had escaped was calling her back. The truth, when it came, was harder to reconcile than the fighting. The debriefing happened in Mitchell's secure office. The room smelled of stale coffee, dust, and ozone from the burned-out generators. Rosa sat across from Mitchell and Harrison, while Chief Reeves stood quietly in the corner. Reeves, the only one who had dared to look closer, was finally getting his answers. Mitchell began by reading the official file. Her voice was clinical, professional. Motor transport operator, logistics assignments, qualifications, basic combat heavy vehicle license. Nothing unusual, nothing that explains what apparently just happened tonight. Harrison cut in. He was all business, no emotion. "Her official file is accurate as far as it goes, Colonel, but Staff Sergeant Dean has a secondary file." He paused, letting the weight of the next sentence settle. "It's classified at a level requiring special access. I've been authorized to provide context." Mitchell clearly didn't appreciate that one of her soldiers had a significant hidden background. "She's one of yours, then?" she asked Harrison. "Not anymore," Harrison replied, "but she was for 7 years." He detailed the life Rosa had tried to escape, embedded with naval special warfare units, providing critical combat support in maritime and littoral environments. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and several other locations that don't appear in official documentation. She was a specialist in the gray area between fighting and surviving. She completed 187 missions with SEAL teams, Harrison stated plainly. 187 missions where conventional support was impossible. She was the logistics, the medical, the extraction. Sometimes she was the overwatch. He added, almost as an afterthought, that her success rate had made her something of a legend in the communities that operate outside the lines. Reeves straightened slightly in the corner. His astonishment was palpable. 187 missions. That's not possible, sir, he said, speaking without thinking. Nobody deploys that frequently at that level of intensity without complete psychological breakdown. The burn rate is too high. Harrison's smile was thin, a knowing, weary expression. Staff Sergeant Dean isn't nobody, Chief. She's one of fewer than 20 personnel who completed a specialized program combining advanced tactical training with logistics and support operations. He looked at Rosa, a look of profound, shared exhaustion. The support personnel we send when the mission is too dangerous for conventional support and too important to risk operational failure. Rosa sat quietly while her hidden history was systematically revealed. The years of silent resilience, the personal toll of a life spent constantly on the brink, the heavy, broken weight of her past. The question, Mitchell said, focusing on command concerns, is why someone with that background was driving ambulances at my base while concealing their true nature. Transition program, Harrison explained. Operators who have done extended time in highly classified programs need to rotate into conventional forces. It's for long-term psychological health and to integrate back into normal military life. It's a kind of personal and professional decompression. He continued. Dean volunteered for the transition. The terms were simple. She'd work a standard deployment, perform conventional duties, and not advertise her background unless circumstances made it absolutely necessary. That was the only way she could find peace. And tonight, Mitchell finished, the respect in her voice now absolute. Tonight was absolutely necessary. Harrison confirmed it, ensuring there would be no negative administrative consequences. She did exactly what she was trained to do when the situation demanded it. She broke cover to save lives. Mitchell looked at Rosa, a woman she had dismissed as merely a driver. I'm not going to discipline someone who saved a dozen lives and held a perimeter, she said. But I can't ignore that I have an operator with advanced special operations capabilities who's been hiding here. Harrison turned back to Rosa. This was the crux of the meeting, the choice, the ultimate moral inflection point. You fulfilled the terms of your transition program beyond any reasonable interpretation, Dean. He presented the two options. You could request immediate reassignment back to your previous community, return to operating at the highest levels, back to the shadows where you belong. He paused, letting the comfort of the familiar world beckon. Or you could choose to stay here, continue serving in a conventional logistics role, and complete your deployment as originally planned. The world Rosa had created, the quiet, simple life of the ambulance driver, was shattered, but the choice was hers. The heavy burden of true capability demanded a new decision. She had to decide whether to retreat to the familiar competence of the past or to embrace the messy, challenging reality of the present. Her entire future hung on a single word. She chose to stay, but why? The choice hung in the air of the secure office, thick and heavy, more potent than the smoke outside. Rosa took a slow, deep breath, pulling the dusty desert air into her lungs. She thought about the 3 weeks of quiet, peaceful routine, the monotony that had been a psychological sanctuary. She thought about Webb and his team who had dismissed her but who had also fought hard tonight. They were arrogant, yes, but they were not cowards. They were just untrained for this level of brutality. She thought about Carter, the medic who had performed life-saving work under fire despite his obvious terror. She thought about all the soldiers at Phoenix, doing their best with the limited tools they had been given. The easy answer was to return to her old life, to the adrenaline and competence where she was valued and understood. where the mission was clear and the lines were drawn with blood, where she never had to justify her existence. But the powerful, enduring feeling she carried wasn't fear or pride. It was hopeful, hope for change, hope for competence in others, hope that the skills she had spent a lifetime acquiring could be used for something other than killing. "I'd like to stay and complete my deployment as planned," she said quietly. Her voice was the same calm, controlled instrument she used to request a supply restock. "Continue driving the ambulance, supporting medical operations, and teaching people here what I know." She looked directly at Mitchell. "So maybe next time they face a crisis, they're better prepared, so they don't have to rely on a one-off miracle to survive." Harrison nodded, showing no surprise. He knew the character of the woman sitting before him. "You always did prefer building capabilities in others rather than being the solo hero, Dean. That was always your quiet strength." "The logistics matter," Rosa said. "The preparation matters. And I want to make sure the next ambulance driver they send here knows more than how to change a tire." Harrison stood. "I'll file the appropriate paperwork. For official records, you remain the motor transport operator. What happened tonight will be classified. The base's official report will credit a successful QRF action supported by fire from an unknown friendly position." Outside the base, she was still just an ambulance driver. But the real soldiers, the ones who had fought and then stared in awe, knew the truth. Her new identity was not a secret. It was a gift. Over the following weeks, Phoenix slowly returned to normal. Rosa continued driving her ambulance. But the way people treated her had changed completely. The invisibility was gone. It was replaced by a quiet, profound respect. Soldiers nodded with genuine acknowledgement. Medical personnel sought her guidance on trauma care under duress. Even Webb approached her one morning with a fragile humility. "Dean," he said, avoiding her eyes, "I was wrong about you, completely, totally wrong. I don't know what else to say except I'm sorry." He didn't make an excuse for his arrogance. She looked at him steadily. "No malice, only truth. You can start by treating everyone with respect regardless of their job, Staff Sergeant," she said. "Ambulance drivers and logistics personnel aren't lesser soldiers. We're all doing necessary work, just different necessary work." Webb managed a rueful smile, acknowledging the profound truth of her statement. "Fair point. Also, would you be willing to run some tactical training for those of us who thought we knew combat but apparently have significant gaps in our knowledge?" "That," Rosa said, returning to her inspection, a slight, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips, "I can definitely do." She taught classes, not in a classroom but in the motor pool during the downtime. She shared lessons from 187 missions without revealing a single classified detail. She taught tactical movement. She taught combat medicine under fire. She taught defensive operations and vehicle utilization in close-quarters combat. The training rippled through the base. It improved capabilities across multiple units. The true reward of her silence was the shared strength she was now cultivating. She had achieved her own personal redemption, not by seeking glory but by teaching survival. She was turning her trauma into knowledge, her isolation into connection. The knowledge was now a legacy, not a burden. 2 months later, as the deployment neared its end, Chief Reeves pulled her aside again. They stood near the maintenance bay, the same place where he first observed her meticulous habits. The circle felt complete. "I've been offered a position," Reeves said, "developing training curriculum for combat support personnel at Fort Lee. They want to build a program teaching people how to operate when logistics and combat blur together." He looked at her, his eyes clear and direct. "They want the Dean protocol, and I told them I'd only take the job if you came as co-instructor." Rosa considered the offer. Everything she'd learned, every moment of fear, every secret calculation, it could be systematically passed on. It could build capabilities across the entire force. Teaching seemed like the right next step. a way to multiply her impact far beyond individual operations, a way to truly find peace by ensuring others wouldn't have to endure the same isolation she had. "I'll take it, Chief," she said, "but only if my official title is Instructor, Combat Logistics Operations." Reeves laughed, a genuine warm sound. "Deal, you'll be the best instructor they've ever had." On her last day at Phoenix, she made a final supply run. Webb and Carter rode along, both having become something like true, quiet friends. The atmosphere was comfortable, a brotherhood and a sisterhood forged in shared fire. As they drove through the Iraqi desert one last time, Webb finally asked the question that had been bothering him since the night of the attack. The true, emotional question. "That night," he began, his voice low, "when you went after that machine gun position alone, were you scared?" Rosa was quiet for a long moment, watching the familiar, endless road ahead. She allowed the honesty to settle over her. "Terrified," she admitted. She gripped the wheel not with tension but with acknowledgement. "But fear is just information. It tells you the stakes are high. It tells you where the threat is. What matters is what you do with that information." "And what did you do with it?" Carter asked, leaning forward from the back. "I did my job," she said. "Same as everyone else that night. I just had a different job description written on my heart." They rode in comfortable silence after that. Three soldiers who had learned a fundamental, life-changing truth, that capabilities often hide in the most unexpected places, that the person who seems unremarkable might be exactly who you need when everything goes wrong, and that doing your job sometimes means stepping far outside your job description because lives depend on it. Rosa Dean went on to train thousands of support personnel. She fundamentally changed how the military prepared its logistics soldiers for modern warfare. She never forgot the weeks of being invisible, the night everything changed, and the quiet, profound lesson that sometimes the most important thing you can do is let people underestimate you until the moment they desperately need you to be something more. The wolf doesn't announce itself to the sheep. It just does what wolves do when the sheep need protecting. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.